Hello everyone and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey. I'm the Executive Director of APA Ohio and Vice Chair of the New Urbanism Division, and I will be your moderator for today's webcast. Today, Friday, March 21st, we will hear the presentation, Connecting Public Lands, Planning to Local Communities. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call the 1-800 number shown. For content questions related to the presentation, type those in the questions box also located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of sponsoring chapters and divisions. I'd like to thank all of those participating sponsors for making these webcasts free and possible. Today's webcast is sponsored by the Nevada chapter. For more information on this chapter and how to become a member, visit apanevada.org. To learn more about all our chapters, visit planning.org/chapters, and to learn about our divisions, planning.org/divisions. On your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. To register for these webcasts, please visit utah-apa.org/webcasts. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, visit planning.org/CM, select today's date and today's webcast. This webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. Some recorded webcasts are available for distance education. For availability of our distance education credits, check the webcast page, utah-apa.org/webcasts. Like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our upcoming sessions. We are recording today's webcast, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. And a PDF of the PowerPoint will also be available at ohioplanning.org/webcast presentations. All right, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today and get started. Mark Spencer. Mark is currently the field manager with the Bureau of Land Management's Red Rock Canyon and Sloan Canyon National Conservation Areas, Southern Nevada District. Prior to moving to Nevada, he worked with the BLM in New Mexico as the State Planning and Environmental Coordinator. His career has been at the county, state, and federal government levels in environmental planning, community development, and management. This experience has provided him an appreciation of intergovernment relationships and the importance of local government, tribal, and public involvement in planning on federal public lands. Mark started his career with the BLM in Washington, D.C., where he helped to coordinate land use and resource planning efforts in the western states at the policy level. Prior to coming to the BLM, he was the Deputy Director of Resource Planning with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. And he also worked with the Appalachian Regional Commission in Community and Economic Development. Mark is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and has a Master of Planning with an Environmental Studies concentration from the University of Virginia and a Bachelor of Science from George Mason University. So, without further ado, I would like to turn things over to Mark and get our presentation going. Mark.
Thanks so much, Christine. Are we on the air? We'll see if we can get the slides up. Can everybody see the slides?
Yep, we're looking good.
Wonderful. Good. Well, good morning. It's a real pleasure to use the high tech and I think reach almost 500 participants today, literally from coast to coast, and just shows you the amazing tools of technology that we have at our hands. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit, as Christine mentioned, about connecting public lands to local communities as it pertains to the Bureau of Land Management and basically how we conduct business. Before I get into the business at hand, though, I like to do a little plug where I get to work. And if you look at the lower left picture, I work at Red Rock Canyon National Conservation Area. It's located about 20 minutes west of Las Vegas, Nevada. And that picture on the lower left is a view from my office. So I do have to gloat a little bit. It's wonderful to work at this place. Red Rock was designated a national conservation area. It's part of the Bureau of Land Management's National Conservation Land System. It was designated back in 1990. And I think you can see why. It has spectacular resources, amazing geological history, documented early Native American sites going back 1,000 years, fantastic recreational opportunities such as rock climbing, and the list goes on and on. So here's my offer to all the participants. If you ever plan to do a tour of the Southwest and hit some of the national parks such as Death Valley and Yosemite, please come by to Red Rock and knock on my door. I always enjoy meeting our colleagues who are either planners or resource managers in the field, and I mean that sincerely. So let's get on with the business of talking about the Bureau of Land Management. I'm going to admit that what I'm going to try to do in an hour easily could be done in a number of courses, from the National Environmental Policy Act, which some of you may have had a lot of experience with, to even just talking about the history of the Bureau of Land Management, as well as the history of the Western settlement of the United States. So I'm throwing, I'll admit, the entire kitchen sink at everybody today, which, as you probably remember, our professors don't particularly like us to do. But here's the rationale. The rationale is that I know we do have listeners on the East Coast from Maryland and Delaware, and if any Maryland chapter listeners are there, my former colleagues, best to you all. You may have limited knowledge of the Bureau of Land Management and how we actually conduct planning, because basically BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, is a Western agency. Its roots were in the Western United States. And conversely, I know we have listeners in the Midwest and all the way out to the West Coast. And you might be very familiar with how we do business. And you may have been a cooperating agency, for example. So I hope at best this is going to be a good refresher for you. The great thing about a webinar is if any of our participants doze off, the speaker doesn't have to see it. So I guess that's another advantage of a webinar as well. So today's topics, I'm going to try to build some foundations in parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about BLM history because it's really interesting how BLM was formed, and then get into how that history drove its subsequent laws, regulations, and policies. Then ratchet it down in sort of a part 3, how that is applied to our resource management planning for lands managed by BLM and opportunities for involvement, both public as well as local and state governments. And then ratchet it down a little bit further, more specifically get into the planning process with the Bureau of Land Management. How do we do resource management plans, and how can local governments be involved in that process? So there's our mission. And even though BLM may not be well known in parts of the United States, we are the largest public land manager of any of the federal agencies compared to the Forest Service or the National Park Service, for example. We manage about 245 million surface acres. If you had to apply that to the East Coast, that would stretch from Florida to Maine. And we manage about 700 million subsurface acres in the United States. And that refers to mineral estate. And look at the map there. You'll see the map. The orange is public lands managed by BLM, primarily in the West. We do have an Eastern States office. Its focus is a great deal on mineral management, or managing mineral resources, subsurface estate. So the question is, historically, to steal a phrase from one of my favorite rock groups back in the 80s and 90s, is how did we get here? You know, how did BLM wind up being BLM, in contrast to the National Park Service and its history, and the U.S. Forest Service, for example, which was a lot more clean. Really, I think the formation of BLM was really just sort of a random historical collision of events that precipitated in American history during the past 200 years. So that multiple use mission, and which we'll get into shortly, is everything you see up there before you and even more. We have a very broad legislative mandate. We talk about multiple use, the sideboards for allowable uses, contingent on our resource management plans, and different laws and regulations are pretty wide, wider than the Forest Service, much wider, of course, than the National Park Service or the Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for managing refuges. So you have oil and gas. You do have great recreation. We do rangeland management, cows, sheep. We do mineral resource management, rock, gold, silver. Very, very different, in comparison to the National Park Service. So that is that multiple use mandate that you have. With the exception of Red Rock Canyon and our other national conservation lands, those lands generally, and I'm speaking in a general way, are much more analogous to the national park. Those sideboards are more narrowly defined because Red Rock and our other conservation land units were established by their own particular legislation. All right, so it's not going to be quite 200 years in 2 minutes, but almost. But it's kind of an interesting history. When you look at the Bureau of Land Management and how do we wind up with all those lands that were in yellow on that map that I showed earlier, all right, go way back to your high school history and maybe a 301 American Frontier Survey course if you ever took something like that in college. And remember those maps, the famous maps? I had a quote allegedly from Horace Greeley. He may not have actually penned it. He was, I think, an editor for the New York Tribune. But at any rate, you remember what happened. You had the progression of settlement in the western United States. You had President Polk and the Manifest Destiny thing, and all these territories out west, of course, became states over time. But ultimately, as the western frontier was developed, the question was to the government is how are we going to manage these public lands? These federal lands is probably in a more appropriate term because there are all those federal lands out there, settlers coming out west as early as the 18th century. What agency or how could you actually do it? And that is related to the General Land Office. You probably remember the GLO, possibly in bad B-grade westerns back in TV, perhaps if you've ever watched them. GLO is often stationed in various parts of the West, and they were the primary administrator for the surveying and the platting and the sale of federal lands in the American West. Hamilton had that idea that was needed even in 1790, and then eventually the General Land Office was formed, I think, in around 1812. Now, the interesting thing with this agency, because this is going to tie directly to BLM, you're probably thinking, why is Spencer talking about this? And you'll see why, is that the General Land Office was in operation for the better part of 200 years, and it kept being handed more and more federal land management responsibilities, far greater than it actually could handle, far greater than its resource capacity or skills or abilities. So you can't fault the agency in itself. Even by like 1862, if you remember, President Lincoln, the Homestead Act was passed. So you went from sale of federal lands to go out west and claim your 160 acres, your quarter section of land for your farm, the Westward Ho thing. And so the GLO started to administer that. And then by the early 20th century, the General Land Office started to administer grazing leases on federal lands because you had the ranchers and the farmers using those federal lands that were claimed essentially by the United States for their cattle or their sheep. What happened then over time is that the GLO became under a lot of criticism because it just could not handle all of these different tasks or mandates, including mineral management as well. So what did they do? Well, you have to jump ahead a number of years. And the Taylor Grazing Act was passed in 1934. It established the grazing service, and so they sort of parsed out that function or responsibility from the General Land Office to the grazing service. And they obviously did what the name implies. They worked with farmers and ranchers and the use of those federal lands principally for grazing. Despite that assignment being made to the grazing service, they still became under criticism. And I think in fairness, because similar to the GLO, they had just too much to do, didn't have the resources to do it well. They did as best as they could. If you remember that map again we looked at a little bit earlier, you had the lands managed by the BLM, and I should have put also some lands in green to denote Forest Service lands and Park Service lands, lands that eventually became parks over time. Because if you can envision that map, you have land still owned or owned by settlers, privately owned lands out west, which is the white. You have parks being formed, and then you have the Forest Service being formed with forest reserve lands. Anything else that was left of federal land, then it's greatly simplified, but it was a distilling process, became the Bureau of Land Management. And in 1946, they combined the Grazing Service and the General Land Office essentially to create BLM. Christine, if I use too many acronyms, and I'm very sensitive to this to our colleagues, you can slap me upside the face. And I will always try to, oops, I think we lost something here. Are we still on? Christine?
Yes, we're still here. I'm not sure why you lost your screen.
Right, there we go.
There we go. Okay.
You know what? I apologize to participants. I have an automatic pop-up, which can be death on Google. All right, so any of the lands that were essentially sifted out and not claimed as Forest Service lands or Park Service lands or privately held became ultimately BLM, and that's where you get that vast acreage that we described earlier that's actually managed by us. So in contrast to the Park Service and the Forest Service, where things were moving fairly early to the formation eventually of the Park Service, with Yellowstone being designated in 1872 and the Park Service established in the 20th century, and the Forest Service that you see there on that particular slide, things were moving quickly, but BLM was more slow to evolve, just again, because of the way these events actually occurred or transpired. Now, notice when I said in 46, with the BLM being formed, actually there was no organic legislation such as with the National Park Service. There was no founding legislation at that time. So BLM continued to try to manage as best as they could, kind of similar to the Grazing Service and GLO, despite this consolidation of public lands under one agency. It had to respond to a number of laws, often conflicting, didn't make sense, and the Bureau of Land Management became under criticism, and again, mostly due to a lack of driving legislation to solidify how we're going to manage these remaining public lands and how we're going to plan for them. So it really wasn't until the 1960s that big changes actually occurred. And there are two laws that really drove the final founding legislation for the Bureau of Land Management, actually almost 10 years later than the Classification and Multiple Use Act that you see there before you, 1964, CMU. Okay, I'll fall for the acronym. We're not going to get into the law above, which was founded or actually passed by Congress in '61, but I'm going to focus on the Classification and Multiple Use Act. This act actually was driven through by Secretary Udall in the 1960s, and this was during the third conservation wave, if you want to call it, that was happening at that time. And the act, when it was passed, really helped the Bureau of Land Management set up its policy direction both for management and for planning. And the act directed the BLM to no longer just react to all of these uses that were being proposed on public lands on a case-by-case basis and signing off on grazing permits or mining permits, for example. Instead, it said, we want you to classify these public lands. We want you to assess them. We want you to inventory them, determine their resource value, determine which lands are suitable for disposal, and then also what should be retained, and provide some recommendations on how you're going to manage these lands. It was a huge task because the Classification and Multiple Use Act was a temporary act. It wasn't permanent. It wasn't designed to be permanent, but for a number of reasons, it was temporary, yet it provided the BLM an opportunity to start solidifying policy and direction. There were 3 directors back in the early 60s, without wading into detail about them with the exception of one, that really were way ahead of their time, and they really pushed through some significant principles dealing with public land management, conservation of resources, as well as planning. And that was Landstrom, Stoddard, and Rasmussen. And Landstrom was an attorney by training, which was perfect because he worked very closely with Secretary Udall on drafting and getting the Classification and Multiple Use Act passed. At that time, BLM really didn't have a good organizational structure, and they kind of reorganized the Bureau to be more responsive to local communities by eventually establishing what we call today field offices. What was really interesting is he along with Stoddard, who was the second in line, established that interdisciplinary team concept, the old ID team, something that planners and all of us take for granted today. So this was a big move from administration, permits and leases, adjudication, to proactively managing and proactively planning, and planning done by the contributions of different disciplines in the field in order to make better decisions. And something, again, it's fun that we do this all the time, I know, as community planners, state planners, or if you were the federal government. But this is a big change back then. The other big changes were, where I think particularly Stoddard was coming from, is he recognized the need for planning. And BLM did not have a planning system. They did not have plans in place. If I recall, Stoddard graduated from the University of Wisconsin. I don't know if we have any Wisconsin listeners out there, but he actually sent some of his resource staff to attend classes on regional planning at the University of Wisconsin. Really interesting, because he recognized the value of planning that's needed to make good decisions. And then he started the first actual plans called Master Framework Plans, which set the stage for how we do planning today. We call them resource management plans. And again, going from case-by-case decisions to working with the public to draft an agenda on how you're going to manage these public lands for the future. And if you notice the second bullet, the public involvement process, again, something all of us take for granted today. Bear in mind, NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, wasn't signed into law almost 10 years later when this was going on. He recognized the need for public involvement. So did Secretary Udall. The other agencies were going in that direction. So along with the planning process, he integrated public involvement. And a lot of, or I should say a few managers had great reservations. Public involvement, that may delay the planning process. We can't have that. So Stoddard was very strategic, and he set up some pilots, and it worked so well that convinced the rest of the management staff that this is a good way to go, to get the public involved so we can make better decisions. And also land designations, designating special lands and how they should be managed by the BLM, such as Red Rock, started to come into place as well. So despite all these attempts, though, in 1960, BLM was still facing a lot of challenges, largely because of budget and not having adequate staff and not having an organic legislation analogous to the Park Service. So you had a lot of abuse on public lands, you had dumping of trash, you had races that were occurring, I say off-road, OHV, that's what that means, for example, in California. So one thing BLM did, and this is kind of a sidebar, is they said we really need to improve our image, and also we need to get the word out to the public to educate them about the values of these lands that are managed by the Bureau. So the Forest Service has Smokey the Bear. And what were we going to do? And this is pretty advanced for the Bureau at that time. They came up with this guy called Johnny Horizon. And that was the BLM mascot, believe it or not, back in 1970. And all they managed to get, and I don't know the specific history of this, maybe any of the listeners with BLM could chime in via keyboard, but they managed to enlist quite a few popular singers at that time, as you can see, Gwen Campbell and Burl Ives, and I think that's Sonny and Cher down the lower right corner. And they did songs and, you know, not trash BL lands and do not dump on them. So that was interesting. Eventually they phased out Johnny Horizon. I'm not quite sure why. If you look at him closely, some of the listeners, depending on, shall we say, experience or age, might see that he kind of recognizes the Marlboro Man. But at any rate, he was eventually discontinued. Incidentally, they even had a Johnny Horizon environmental test kit that somehow BLM managed to contract out or make an arrangement with Parker Brothers. You could buy this test kit that had water quality sampling tools and all this stuff. And one of our staff members, Gene, actually found an unused test kit on eBay, which he brought into my office after I did a similar presentation on him last year. So if you ever want to find a Johnny Horizon test kit, go onto eBay and see if you can locate one. So BLM did grow over a number of years, and our budget today is about over $1 billion. It's one of the fewer agencies that actually generate surplus revenues, primarily from mineral royalties. Our revenues are greater than our budget. And this was a source I obtained back in 2011 on an annual report, where obviously the Bureau, through the use and management of public lands, generates quite a bit to the local and national economy. And you can see those figures there. When we talk about payments in lieu of taxes, that is an arrangement with states where, because that land is federal land or public lands, it cannot be taxed. The Bureau of Land Management actually pays out a PILT, payment in lieu of taxes, based on the amount of land that's managed in a particular state. And I gave that example for Nevada up there on the screen. All right, let's talk about the fun stuff, and I'll try to make it light. It's kind of hard when you talk about laws, regulations, and policies. When I remember, and I always try to emphasize being a planner with Maryland, is when I started with the Bureau of Land Management, and actually I was a cooperating agency when I worked with Maryland, and we actually worked with BLM on one of its few planning forays on the East Coast. I remember that the federal government does business quite a bit differently compared to quite a few states, and especially local government. And I think because of the laws that we have to deal with, and then the subsequent regulations which expand on those laws, and then the policies, it makes it really prescriptive on how we do planning. It doesn't take away creativity, but we have to do these things to comply with the law. Now, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act was passed in 1976. So if you recall, BLM was formed in 46. The CMU, Classification of Multiple Use Act, had expired, and it wasn't until 76 until BLM's organic legislation, if you were, was actually established, FLPMA. Okay, we'll use an acronym. And that really spelled out how BLM was going to do business, as well as respond to quite a few other environmental and cultural resource laws. The really neat thing about this act that I always found, and I think planners will, is that in Section 202 of the Act, it has a lot of language on how the BLM is to conduct land use planning. And it's really interesting. It says BLM must do land use plans. The land use plans must relate to our decisions on how they're made on the ground. It has involvement requirements like you see before you, where the Secretary shall keep local governments and tribes not only apprised of our planning process, but we need to know what's going on at the local level as well. It's really landmark, and that's kind of reflective of Stoddard, if you remember who I mentioned, the second director of BLM, who was very focused on planning to help make good decisions. So laws, regulations, and policies. That's it, kind of laid out in 3 bullets before you. That we do our planning and decision making based on public involvement, and that there are 2 driving acts on how we do planning on BLM land. One is FLPMA, which I just described before, and its planning requirements. And the second is the National Environmental Policy Act, which actually was signed into law in the 1970s, I think signed by Nixon in '69, if you all remember. It's interesting because FLPMA does have some very similar language that the National Environmental Policy Act has in respect to planning, doing an environmental analyses, impact analyses, and then coming up with alternatives and eventually a decision or a plan. So these 2 laws, we really have to kind of follow and envision them like 2 railroad tracks going down the line. FLPMA on the left side, NEPA on the right, and that we kind of go through those requirements as we actually develop our land use plans, or we do simply an environmental impact statement or an environmental assessment. Because, as I mentioned, the federal legal system and these laws still are a bit general, we use a Code of Federal Regulations, which many of you are probably familiar with if you've worked with us, or worked with other agencies, or even on a project that requires complying with NEPA or the Environmental Policy Act. So the CFRs, as we call it, for our organic legislation and other laws, are really designed to amplify, clarify, provide further guidance on how we do planning and how it must be done. And then just like any local or state government, we have policies which further amplify and clarify how we're supposed to do business. And I'll have some go-to references at the end. We have a BLM planning handbook, which is available online, which I found very helpful for local and state governments as well. And our environmental policy handbook too. You can both get those online if you're ever interested, or if you can't sleep at night, you can print out a copy and take it home. Opportunities for involvement, coordination and consultation. Our CFRs do expand both on planning and opportunities for public participation, which is really key. And you can see that requirement, which I particularly like, very similar to the requirements in the National Environmental Policy Act, which we shall provide the public opportunities to meaningfully participate in the preparation of plans. And that's a great quote, I think. And that's really important. I think sometimes I've observed, and I've felt it when I worked with a state agency, frustration from local governments or state governments on a somewhat laborious process, again, a prescriptive process, as I mentioned, on why and how we have to do planning. And again, it still relates to these legal requirements. And if we don't do them right, if we do not do our due diligence, and even though it's the right thing to do regardless, that we can set ourselves up, frankly, for litigation, for example, or protracting or unnecessarily protracting a planning process. This is PowerPoint poisoning. I'm not going to make any apologies, and here's why. I just want people, if you want to run this off or have the text in front of you, I know have violated every PowerPoint principle you have, but this way you can at least run it off, consider it a class or more of a workshop, and then you can still have context with the slides rather than me just talking. So there's the opportunities for coordination. We have formal opportunities and informal opportunities, and I should say more informal. There's a wide range of how local governments, tribes can be involved, and the public can be involved. And that text is pretty self-explanatory that you see before you. The key thing is that we do have other laws too, like working with tribes, that require us to do tribal consultation. And then again, that is also mentioned in our planning regulations as well. So you'll see redundancy or reiteration many times of both resource management as well as planning requirements. But I find it really interesting with some of this verbiage that you have before you, is that it says that we must assist in resolving to the extent practicable inconsistencies between federal and non-federal government plans when we're working on a plan that involves both public lands and then may affect adjoining communities. Likewise, meaningful public involvement for other federal agencies. And where possible and appropriate, develop our resource management plans with cooperating agencies, which I'm going to touch on in a minute. Local governments, state governments do have an opportunity to become a cooperating agency in our planning process, which allows one essentially an amped up opportunity for involvement in helping to make decisions. I mentioned NEPA, which I'm not going to get into, and some of you are very familiar with the National Environmental Policy Act. And I'm going to talk about our planning process in a moment. But again, when we develop a plan, essentially when we comply with the Environmental Policy Act, our alternatives must be analyzed for their impacts when we're developing that plan. And then ultimately our preferred or proposed decision, whatever you want to call it, ultimately becomes our plan. But regardless, we have to analyze the impacts of each alternative. We have to have an open and transparent public process. We have to base our plan on issues so they're relevant and germane. And any decisions we do, just like with our colleagues who are listening now, they must be based on a strong rationale, regardless if it's local, state, or federal government. You've got to have the rationale. The purpose of our plan, the same as yours, it's really important. You have to assess your environment. Your alternatives must be based on issues that have been identified. And then, which makes our plans a bit challenging, is we have to still comply and fold into that planning process other federal laws, ranging from the Wilderness Act back in Udall's time all the way down to the bottom, and many, many more, as you all probably are aware, such as the Endangered Species Act of 1973. So those acts all have to be folded in the process, and if you recall, and just like you probably have in your work environment, that's where that interdisciplinary team is so critical, because they're the ones who know these other acts and requirements that relate to good resource management decisions that are so inherent in the planning process. All right, I'm going to take a little sip of water here for a moment. Let's talk about BLM's planning process. Very similar to regional planning that you probably see before you. Nothing's new, going back to Stoddard in the 1960s and University of Wisconsin. Sometimes it's asked, why are our plans 2 feet thick? I say that sometimes, a little tongue-in-cheek there, hundreds and hundreds of pages. That's a whole other discussion in itself, and a lot of it's due to legal requirements. Generally, though, our planning process is a blueprint. It's just going to explain how we are going to make management decisions. And I don't really like to say 10 years or 20 years. We're very careful not to set up a framework on a time limitation on a plan. But generally, you're looking in that time span. With things changing so quickly, though, in the West and more development with cities expanding and changing issues, though, we have found that we've had to amend our plans frequently on Bureau of Land Management lands to respond to those changing conditions. So a plan amendment is often how we get up to speed with the current times. Plans also establish goals and objectives for how we're going to manage the lands, desired outcomes as we call it, and then how we're actually going to meet those objectives. Now, let's see if I got it up next. Yeah, here it is. Okay, so if you kind of take away the names on your left, you're really kind of looking at a regional or comprehensive plan. It could even almost be a zoning plan to try to relate to some of the listeners out here. Again, going back to Stoddard. Besides having these qualitative descriptions of how we're going to manage lands, we actually have then a map of the area that we're planning for, such as Red Rock. It'd be a good example of Red Rock. We don't do necessarily minerals management. And working through alternatives in the public and decisions, these program areas we designate on the map. Areas of critical environmental concern. Those are areas that have special or unique values. How many acres and how are you going to map that? Special recreation management areas. I don't need to explain it because it's sort of self-explanatory. Travel management refers to how a road is going to be managed and used. Are you going to have open roads where anybody can drive on them? Are you going to close areas to OHV use, etc.? Realty. Because the BLM has some very wide sideboards, again, for how we manage our lands and what are allowable uses, we do allow rights-of-ways. We work with towns. Often the town may need a new 500 kV line in order to get that electricity to the community. A proposal is made to put that line through BLM public lands and elsewhere to get there. So those are realty decisions. Rights-of-ways, realty, that's how we kind of refer to that. That also refers to renewable energy, such as solar being proposed on BLM lands, or wind turbines, for example, pipelines, and the list goes on and on. The exclusion areas that you see down the bottom left is you can't have any realty actions there. Likely because it might be related to the top bar, an area of critical environmental concern that's being proposed to be designated. So I hope that makes sense. And it's again, it's the very same principle that we do for regional planning or comprehensive planning as well. Nothing new. So we're updating a heck of a lot of plans throughout the Bureau all the time, as I mentioned. And again, just things change really quick. I mentioned renewable energy. 10 years ago, that wasn't on our radar that this would become a national initiative with our president. It's a very important initiative. So working with proponents in the public on proposals that deal with solar energy, again, and wind farms have become a very big workload both in Nevada as well as the state of California for the Bureau of Land Management. All right, here we go. The old planning compound complex molecule. Everybody's seen this, and just like some of those regional planning concepts we were talking about earlier, you all have variations of this, I know, in your planning process. The difference, again, I think to some degree is what we have to do is very prescriptive, though it doesn't really disallow some very creative opportunities for getting the public or local governments involved. And because it's prescriptive, our planning process, if we don't do it right, more often than not, when the Bureau gets challenged for developing a plan, often it's not on the content or the approach, but very often it's on possibly violating some legal aspect or requirement of the planning process. So we don't want to do that. It's real important that we adhere to these gotta-dos. Just like all any planning process at the local or state level, we have to know what's there and assess the data, and we develop issues, working with the public, and those issues set up the sideboards for what is going to be considered in the plan. And those sideboards then are really expressed as planning criteria, what will be considered and what will not be considered in the plan. When we start working on the plan itself, as I mentioned, be a little reiterative, that we develop alternatives, which relates back to the Environmental Policy Act. The alternative one might be a variation of a proposed plan, a resource management plan. Alternative two might be another variation of the plan. Alternative three might be another variation of the plan. And we look at the effects of those alternatives, the environmental impacts on the resources. After the draft plan is released to the public and we get comments on that, we identify a proposed plan, which is, if you go to the lower left of the screen, you'll see issue a draft resource management plan, DRMP. We get public comments on the draft, and then we issue a final plan, a proposed resource management plan, along with the environmental document. When we release that proposed plan, we actually then call one of those alternatives the proposed plan. So you know exactly what's being proposed. Now, interesting that BLM has an unusual outlet valve before a plan, for example, may get to court or challenged through litigation. If you look at the middle lower part of your screen, you'll see resolve protest, issue notice of significant change if applicable. This is a good steam valve, though it's pretty laborious, that if anybody has participated in the planning process, they can write at that point after the final plan has been released and protest the plan. You can't protest it just because you don't like the decision or the alternative. The protester must show a significant deficiency in the formulation of a decision and how it relates to the assessment or the development of alternatives or misinformation or inaccurate information. And so sometimes for controversial plans, you know, that deal with a number of issues in the western states, you can get hundreds of protests. And you have to go through these protests, and sometimes it's good because you may have to take a corrective action for the better, and then go on with your ROD, which is a record of decision. If the protest is not germane or doesn't meet the requirements for showing the required deficiencies, then that protest is dismissed. And again, you might find it interesting being planners out there or resource managers. It's a steam valve. It's a good kind of one more catch if you can change something in case there's a real controversial plan that may ultimately wind up in court. So I hope that helps a little bit different from perhaps the state planning process or local government process, depending on where you are. One comment we have often is that our plans are too general. And sometimes our resource management plans are dealing with millions of acres. In Vegas alone, we have well over 2 million acres in the Las Vegas District Office, and part of that includes Red Rock Canyon and Sloan Canyon National Conservation Areas. So because we're dealing with such vast areas, we often have to ratchet down our environmental analysis for subsequent proposals in a specific area. And often you might have to do the same thing. So we often do that through a subsequent environmental assessment with a decision, or if you have to, an environmental impact statement, but sometimes you hope that that EIS has already been folded into your resource management plan. And we call that kind of tiering. But when you go to specific areas, just like for your resource management plan to make a decision, you're looking at direct effects and indirect effects and cumulative effects of different proposed actions, and then what are those effects on habitat, minerals development, forest, you name it, everything you see there before you. So when we ratchet it down, we call it tiering. You go from a big map, broad decisions, that kind of big zoning map I showed you earlier of BLM decisions, and they're narrowed down from a 30,000 foot to a nose on the ground level when you have to look at a specific action, like a road being proposed to go through BLM land by a county, for example. I'd like to talk a little bit as it relates to those proposals on third-party proposals. What do I mean by third party? Well, there it is before you. I remember I mentioned that the Bureau of Land Management's mission, its sideboards for multiple use management, it's extremely wide. Again, wider than some of our sister agencies. And we do and can entertain different types of proposals from local governments, state governments, tribes, even outside entities on BLM lands, provided it's consistent, and I'm going to get into that word again, or conforms to our resource management plan decisions, and it conforms to the other requirements by law as well. And I've touched on some examples of these types of proposals. Solar or wind, which is a national priority for us now. A special recreation permit. A right-of-way grant for the transmission lines that we discussed earlier. Communities need power, and that's a reality that all of us have to deal with. So the Bureau of Land Management does accept and actually analyze proposals from third parties. It can be a local government, state government, it can be a business entity. And we analyze them to determine if it's doable or not based on prior land use planning decisions. So if you look at that flow process, it's kind of self-explanatory. But usually when we get together with local planners in the West, the county, or perhaps the business entity, let's say Nevada Electric, that's working with a local government agency here, the first thing we do is we put together a pre-application meeting. And we get together with the proponents and we talk about if this proposal can fit within the rubric of our requirements or not. Sometimes these proposals are very, very expensive. And so to not burden the taxpayer, actually we set up a contributory account or fund, a cost reimbursement account, where, for example, a solar company will actually reimburse our staff, our labor, our time for reviewing the environmental document that's prepared, and then also where we actually make the final decision, because it requires a lot of time, as some of you know if you've ever worked with BLM on a proposed solar project, for example, or a wind project. I find it interesting, that process you have before you there on third party. Take a look at the upper right, the old plan conformance thing, just like all of you have. That proposal has to conform with our resource management plans. And hopefully what's in the plan has been analyzed adequately. But again, if it's for a specific area where, let's say, it's open for a right-of-way based on the realty decision, you're still probably going to have to go in for a subsequent environmental analysis. And that's where the proponent's going to have to pay for that cost. So I hope that's clear. If the proposal doesn't conform, if a right-of-way is being proposed, a transmission line through an area that's closed to realty, closed for rights-of-ways, then you can't put it there unless you amend the plan. Just like local governments, you got to amend the plan or consider amending the plan, or you're going to reject the proposal. So that's the plan conformance thing. Specifically identifies whether or not the proposed action is consistent with the terms, conditions, and decisions of the plan. Hey, deja vu of Planning 101 back in college, right? And those are some of the questions and examples that I alluded to earlier. For lack of a better example, because I used to deal with renewable energy quite a bit in southern Nevada, does the plan decision allow, conditionally allow, or preclude the action? And then how are you going to make those decisions based on that analysis? So let's talk about cooperating agencies. I don't know if any of our planners, probably in the West primarily, possibly in the Midwest, have ever worked with the Bureau of Land Management in a planning process as a cooperating agency. we always have to work, and we want to work because it's the right thing to do with local communities and governments. And we can do that through informal consultation, informally working with you. We can meet with you because we're not going to be violating any law that deals with the Federal Advisory Commission Act. And that means we just can't random or willy-nilly meet with the public if we want to. We have to have open meetings, public meetings. But when we work with local governments, we can meet with you one-on-one, and that's a requirement through our laws. If you become or decide to become a cooperating agency, and that's the explanation for what it is, it's self-explanatory, it gives local governments a vastly increased opportunity to provide input to BLM before BLM makes the final decision on planning direction. To be a cooperating agency, you have to have jurisdiction by law. That means you've got to be able to raise your own money. You have to have be some kind of legal entity as a town. You can and or have special expertise, which many local communities do, of course. And it can include tribes, but we found often that tribes don't opt to be cooperating agencies because many tribes consider themselves as nations, and we have our own requirements for working with Native American tribes. Again, a little PowerPoint poisoning there. We're not going to go down everything. But again, what it requires us to do, if you decide to sign on to become a cooperating agency, it gives you, again, an opportunity for much more input. You can really work with us one-on-one, sit down to identify issues that a local government or community feels that should be considered. You can provide much more actively information to us, and we can work with the affected cooperating agency more intensely to look at that data. And it's a lot more effective if you're a cooperating agency to help develop an alternative. Very often a cooperating agency may say, hey, we got an alternative that you would like to, that you should consider in your plan. And that alternative then is actually folded into a draft resource management plan. So it's really important when you work with, and I've found there are always a few bumps historically when I've been a planner working with local communities, but there's some cases, lessons learned here that I think we've all found, is that one is you want to get the cooperating agency, the local government involved right away. And even if you're not a CA, we always want to get local governments involved right away when we're just starting the plan, and more important, really before starting the plan. You want to have that relationship there, and so it's ready to go. And by doing that, when you get the CA involved early, you're not going to duplicate efforts, and you're going to make better decisions ultimately. So, does this relationship, and sometimes I've observed over time that this might be a frustration with local or state governments, does it require the BLM and cooperators, for example, to make decisions by consensus? And that's an ideal world, and all of you are planners, and it'd be really great if we always could work with our different interest groups, which might be very varied, a great deal, to reach consensus, but sometimes that's simply not possible. We always try for it. Collaboration is an operative word, and we try to work with the local governments as much as possible, or communities, to make it consensus-based. Ultimately, just like a local government, state government that's responsible for your domain, the Bureau of Land Management has to make a final decision. And that's a little more on the consensus-based approach as well. But I found it really great and terrifically rewarding to work with cooperating agencies and also work with communities and local government. It's just really critical, as we all know. You certainly don't want to get down the road and come up with a draft plan where you have omitted key players in the planning process. And there's a little quote, a little dated from, I don't know him personally, Mr. Rooney. Incidentally, this is out of our cooperating agency handbook. And there's this quote, and again, cooperating agencies, I forgot, can be state agencies as well, such as the Department of Natural Resources. It can be other state agencies. It can be a regional agency, as long as it meets the cooperating agency requirements. And as I mentioned, you can get this online, which I'll have at the end of the presentation, which I'm just about done. It has a lot of Q&As for you, and it also has a Memorandum of Understanding template. That MOU that we set up with local governments to become a cooperating agency is critical. And it really defines the roles of the Bureau of Land Management and you. It defines the expertise that's going to be provided by the respective agencies, which is really important. You're going to try to hash out a schedule, not only for the plan, but then how and when is the local government, state government going to be involved, and then how and when are comments going to be provided. How you're going to handle pre-decisional information. That's another key point. In your cooperating agency, you're actually looking at pre-decisional information before the draft goes out to the public. That's a major difference between just consulting or working with a local government versus the ability that you have to provide input if you're a cooperating agency. And also how you're going to handle conflict, how you're going to handle disagreement. The more one can flesh out those MOUs, the better it is for reasons we all know. So, I'm almost only 4 minutes off, Christine. And take-home messages. I think those are just 3 bullets of a lot of stuff that I covered today. I hope this was helpful to many of you and not too redundant for some planners or professionals who might be more familiar with how we do business. But the key thing is everything we do on the ground, everything I do with our staff and volunteers, for example, at Red Rock Canyon National Conservation on the ground, must be linked to Red Rock's resource management plan. I just can't make any decision. And there are formal and informal opportunities for getting involved. There are a lot of different avenues for becoming involved. And some of those are more driven by laws and regulations for good things. It's a good thing to do. It's part of our due diligence. But it doesn't really negate our creative ways that we can employ working with you as the Bureau of Land Management to develop a plan or help make decisions on public lands. So I hope that was a help. It's been really a great talking to everybody in such a wide spectrum of a geographical audience. And I'll turn it over for any questions at this point.
Great, thank you. And we do have some questions banked already, so everybody feel free to type in any of your other questions. We have about 25 minutes. The first question, in what ways does BLM regulate lands in or coordinate with cities in the center of high-density metro areas?
Oh, yeah, sure. Really good question. Vegas is we call Vegas, I'll cite this as an example, a big little town. I'm from the East Coast. I used to live around D.C., and that's huge. But with Vegas, Phoenix is another good example. I'm more familiar with those areas. No differently than really what I just explained to you, that the public lands, we call it interface, with expanding communities, is a significant issue. Especially if some of these towns and cities are expanding rapidly. So again, the way we do that is one can be informal with constant or regularly scheduled meetings with our local officials or the local planning professionals or planning department. And I think that, again, that's about relationships, an informal way of communication. For example, the city of Henderson is next to Las Vegas, Nevada. And just 2 weeks ago, I went on a great hike with the city planners in Henderson, where there are archaeologists at Sloan Canyon National Conservation Area, and to talk about Sloan Canyon's attributes and benefits to the city of Henderson as open space, and working with the city on even developing an integrated or coordinated trail system. So that's the informal approach, and I think that communication and relationship regardless of the size of the city, but even if it's larger, that's what we try to do here. And again, with larger, I should say more formal opportunities, you get into the more formal planning process. If you're developing a plan, a resource management plan, we knock on the door of that large city to reach out to the elected officials as well as the related departments or agencies, let's say in that city planning departments, to see if they want to become involved as a cooperating agency or what level of involvement they would like to be. So I hope that kind of encapsulates it. And I think also that communication is two ways, that it's really important that if the city is concerned about an issue or a municipality that, and we're not aware of it because we can't be aware of everything just like everybody, to knock on our door and let us know. I've had regular breakfast meetings with commissioners here as well as county commissioners out in my county. So that relationship and communication on a constant basis is really critical. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Great. Given the current and predicted long-term drying of the West, and given that a dramatic expansion of the western deserts may be a reality for the 21st century, how is the BLM planning for this much drier environment, particularly with the significant loss of grazing acreage and the drying up of aquifers? Boy, these are really good questions.
They really are. and first of all, I'm going to preface this to, how can I do this the best way? You have my contact information. So whoever is asking that question, one is I want to refer you to our state office to really provide you a more in-depth answer than I'm going to provide, okay? And we are working on that, but I want to refer you to our ecologist. A couple of things we've been working on. One is a rapid ecological assessment of our landscapes, which takes into account drought. Drought is very, very big on our radar throughout the American Southwest, as all of you know. The effects of drought also must, like anything, and especially now, must be analyzed in our planning process through resource management plans, environmental impact statements, or EAs. And likewise, trying to come up with better models or predictions of what the landscape is going to look at with this continuing trend and how that is actually folded into an analysis during the planning process. So those are some ways that we're employing now. That's a very good question, which requires an extensive dialogue, and I want to give you more expansive information on that. So that caller, give me a call, shoot me an email, and I'm going to refer you up to Joe in our state office. Likewise, with drought and climate change, how one wants to parse that out and the definitions, that's on our radar, of course, at a policy level as well. And climate change is also considered in our planning process, too.
Okay. Next question. Is it not a slight conflict of interest for the BLM to be paid by the entity doing the proposal on a negotiated basis, or is a federal fee schedule previously established based on an action or value of work involved?
All right. Now to give you two parts. Excellent questions. Really, really good. Because this relates to ethics and how we do business and the need that we conduct, all of us, even if you're a local government, to conduct our business practices in a highly ethical manner. And I'm assuming we're referring to third-party proponents, that discussion that we had earlier, correct? I think so.
I would assume so.
Yeah. I think I mentioned that pre-application meeting, and that when, let's say, it's hypothetical, we sit down with a utility company that is proposing a pipeline across lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Even though they're going to be providing funds for the analysis of this proposed underscore project and the development of alternatives through some kind of environmental document, we're required by law, and we make it crystal clear to the proponent that even though they are providing funds for the development of this project, that the ultimate management and responsibility and decision-making by the BLM is separate from them. They may provide some expertise because of their knowledge. They may help develop the document, but we have to make it, and we do as required by law, very clear to them that even though they're providing sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars to develop an environmental impact statement, that one is, it's the BLM's, the public's environmental impact statement, not the proponents. And that's why that pre-application meeting, that kickoff meeting is so important, so you can make that very clear to the proponent and they understand that. And sometimes you have to work with them so they do understand that. So despite it being funded from the outside, it is BLM and a public document. It does not influence our decision. So for example, if you select a contractor to do the document, we may provide that company, or they can go out and look at contractors to do it, but they have to go through a screening process, a hiring selection process, just like we would do if you're going to hire a contractor internally or the Bureau of Land Management. And that screening process, TPAC as we call it sometimes, it is ultimately managed and handled by the Bureau of Land Management, because when we're screening and looking at those contractors to do the document, ultimately we want the most capable individual or company to do it, because that document's got to hold up to all the requirements that I just discussed earlier. It has to be a good quality document. So BLM must make the final decision, just as an example, on the contractor who's going to do it. And likewise, we work with the company throughout the process, but we make it very clear that ultimately we're the manager of the process. We're looking at the quality of the document to ensure compliance, and then obviously integrating that into all our public and governmental involvement requirements throughout its development. So I hope that answers the first part of your question. As far as how we actually set up a fee structure, we do a cost estimate. And that's done through, and it's an open process, and the public can always look at one. It's just not by any means hidden. Is just like possibly you, when you have to estimate how long projects are going to take and you have to put your hours and labor and all this down, we do exactly the same thing. And like anybody, you become more and more familiar with certain projects over time, such as utility, rights of way, or solar or wind, and you do an Excel spread with estimated staff, who, what, where, labor, total salaries, operational costs, and then that is billed to the third party through an accounting process. So it's very stringent. So I hope that explains both your questions.
Great. Could you comment on the ways that BLM interacts with school districts, many of which build new schools on land adjacent to vacant BLM land, which often leads to isolated facilities far from the students they serve?
Okay, could you repeat that again, please?
Sure. Could you comment on the ways that BLM interacts with school districts, many of which build new schools on land adjacent to vacant BLM land, which often leads to isolated facilities far from the students they serve?
Probably not. I'm sort of chuckling. It's an interesting question because isn't ultimately the decision to locate a school is made by the school, not by BLM. So if it's through an RMPP Act or Recreation and Public Purposes Act where a local government may be able to lease land or have it eventually turned over to him, I'm thinking generally that's going to be a proposal by the school district and not BLM. So I hope, correct me if I'm wrong, listener, if I'm responding to your question correctly. I understand what you're saying, but ultimately where that school is going to be located is not a decision of the BLM.
Okay. How does the BLM work or coordinate with the Department of Defense, especially regarding the Nellis test and training range?
I bet you we have some good Nevada planners out there, or maybe some NTTR. Nevada Test and Training Range listeners out there. Hello, whoever you are. I probably have worked with you. So a number of ways. One, I can't remember the proper term, and they just had a meeting. I used to be more involved with them, but essentially there's an annual meeting, if not more so, with NTTR, the Department of Defense, for example, in Nevada, that we have with all our military liaisons, as well as the Bureau of Land Management, and that also includes other agencies as well. And sometimes those meetings are up to 2 days long with that coordination process. Sometimes it can be issue-driven, such as the development of the current Las Vegas Resource Management Plan, which is being updated, or it may be related to a number of issues. So we use that military cooperating group, that agency cooperating group, as a major tool. Likewise, for example, with the Las Vegas plan, which they're working on now in the Southern District Office here in Nevada, I know that the NTTR representation has been attending previous planning and scoping meetings during the development of that plan. There are even, believe it or not, with NTTR, is a wild horse herd at the Nellis Range, and we work very closely with the NTTR on the ground staff, the Air Force staff out there on a number of resource management projects. So I hope that answers your question. And again, like another example would be with solar and wind. Nevada, as some of the listeners may know, has extensive air training areas for the military. Sometimes proposed solar projects or wind turbines, which are 400 feet high now, pose conflicts with military training space, airspace. So, and those projects particularly, we always bring DOD, the military, in right away to see what may or may not be feasible, depending on where the project is located.
All right. Let's see here. Do you have examples of how BLM is integrating hazard mitigation planning in its work?
I don't have a specific example. If the listener wants me to, actually if the listener doesn't mind, drop me a line and I'll refer you to our hazmat coordinator at the state office, which was recently hired as a matter of fact. So drop me a note. I mean, I can speak in general terms, not specific, that hazmat, well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by hazardous materials. So are you referring to hazardous materials? You might have to close the loop on this with the person who posed the question, Christine. Or are you referring to hazardous sites? Or Superfund sites. I'm not quite clear on the question.
Okay, we'll see if they can respond back to that. So in the interim then,
all right.
Sort of related, are ongoing studies done on hydraulic fracturing, mining, and standard drilling sites?
Yes, and one is, I want to preface that again, where Southern Nevada doesn't have any active fluid mineral, as we call it, sites, so I'm not as boned up on that as I used to be. However, I did work in BLM's New Mexico State Office, as Christine mentioned, where oil and gas is more extensive or common in northern New Mexico around the Farmington area and Carlsbad. And coincidentally, I do know they are starting on such an analysis as you described in the Farmington area. And if you like additional information, give me a call and I'll refer you to Gary, who's our Deputy Director for Minerals Management up in the state office. And that relates also, let me add one more thing, to legal requirements. That's a great example of change through technology, which nobody had known about that particular method for oil and gas at that time, where now we're having to update or revise NEPA documents and analysis in order to address that technology.
Okay. Are brownfields an issue? How are they handled within the context of your resource plans?
I've never had a brownfield, so I'll have to take the fifth on that, but they certainly have to be addressed. Absolutely. I know in Maryland there was quite an extensive brownfield program, and I worked there with the Department of Natural Resources. But again, if we have a brownfield, even a Superfund site, that is folded in through the planning process. And what's kind of interesting is a brownfield, if it's on public land, let's make that very clear, it can actually become designated, this is a bit unusual, as an area of critical environmental concern. The ACECs can have terrific natural resource values. It's a little confusing. That same designation can also apply to hazardous sites with their own particular prescriptions or decisions that apply to them. I can't give you a specific example because I've never had a brownfield involved when I was a planner.
Okay, and we heard back from the previous question. He was referring more to natural hazard mitigation, such as wildfires, flooding, climate change, severe storms.
Yeah, okay, very good. So, and again, repeating the question again, Christine, if you don't mind, was how do we integrate that into planning?
Correct.
Yeah. Take a look at any of our resource management plans, the current, let's see, let me try to think of a recent plan. Look at some of New Mexico's plans or Red Rock Canyons National Conservation Areas, the resource management plan there that you can get online with the go-to links that I had. So for example, wildfire, there are extensive sections or a section in all of our plans now that deal with wildland fire, and both hazard mitigation as well as how addressing that particular issue is going to be integrated into our resource management. And that's a really good question, just focusing on wildfire with our expanding urban areas, especially that public land urban interface, wildland fire mitigation, and working with the communities and integrating those decisions and our plans are fundamental to how we do business today. Likewise, with flooding or other types of hazard, we hope that we're going to catch those issues during the development of any planning process, and again, fold that into an analysis or assessment and subsequent decision. And if we don't know it, we hope the local government will make us aware of it so we can address it too.
Okay, thank you. Next question. BLM wants to put up gates on entrance areas to BLM land, but the access is on county roadways. What rights do BLM have in these types of cases?
I don't have the specifics there on the question, and that's a good question, but I don't know enough about the background information. So a lot of this deals with essentially federal government and local government interpretation of who owns or manages what. So I want to sort of not address that because I don't think I can do it adequately based on what was posed. BLM can only manage the lands that it actually owns. The debate, I think what you're asking about is, well, if this was a pre-existing right-of-way or use by the local government, possibly why has that been gated? And that is a very extensive legal question that I could call up our solicitors and we could get into a whole nother discussion about RS, what we call is RS 2477. So for the person who made the query, shoot me a note, and or if you want to give me a call, I'll be happy to chat with you about that, as well as with our lands and realty staff.
All right. The Red Rocks Canyon Management Plan reads more like a plan for a city park than it does plans for other national conservation areas. How do you balance the needs of a local public with the national expectations of NCA?
Based on public input during the development of the plan. So what I'm possibly hearing is sort of an opinion on the development of the plan or how the plan looks like, which we certainly can appreciate. Ultimately, the decisions that you see there are based on public input. That's my shortest answer to that. Now, that said, Red Rock Canyon is more analogous to a park-like setting, just to the sheer nature of its designation back in 1990, its legislative framework. It does have a heavier emphasis on protection and preservation in its organic language. And that does drive both the sideboards for the plan that perhaps the listener has looked at, as well as the subsequent decisions. So you won't see oil and gas, of course, here at Red Rock because minerals have been withdrawn. We do deal with a lot of recreational issues, some which are very intensive due to the sheer numbers and visitation that we get here. So it's always a challenge. It's still multiple use with more narrow sideboards. But the balancing that use and preservation has always been a challenge, as I think most of our listeners know, with any planner or resource manager.
All right. I think we have time for one more question. Does BLM have any proactive programs or initiatives for protection and nurturing of any endangered species on BML land? BLM?
Not formal. I mean, of course, legislation that comes through to protect areas or designated areas, of course, comes through Congress and passed into bill, or it comes through the president through some kind of order. But again, for protected species, desert tortoise, which is very big on our radar here in southern Nevada, it might be the sage grouse in other parts of the United States. Yes, because when we develop plans, resource management plans, we must consult with our other federal agencies that are responsible for those laws. So when we're working on a plan for Red Rock, Las Vegas, we have to consult with Fish and Wildlife. We work on with them to do a biological assessment of the affected species, particularly the desert tortoise. We come up with a biological opinion with them. And all of those decisions and prescriptions, those stipulations that come out of those documents are folded into our resource management plan. And very often, sometimes we're challenged with our plans on endangered or listed species issues. And that's why we need to do it with due diligence.
All right, great. Well, Mark, thank you. It's already 2:30 here on the East Coast. Thank you very much for joining us. This was really great, and it wasn't dry, and I felt like some of those scary slides were still really useful. So thank you for that. Just a few final reminders. The Nevada chapter, thank you for sponsoring today's webcast, and don't forget to log those CM credits. And if you didn't get a chance to write down Mark's information and you need it, feel free to email us. We'll grab his PowerPoint and post that on the website. And sometime soon, next week probably, you'll see this video. So if you need to check back about some facts, we have that for you. So again, thank you, Nevada. Thank you, Mark. And everyone have a great weekend.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.